In our previous episode, we looked at the testimonies of the United States airmen who claimed to have encountered UFOs in the vicinity of two RAF bases in the closing days of 1980. Now, we will examine what transpired in the aftermath of those alleged sightings, and what possible explanations there are for what took place. The events described as having taken place at Rendlesham Forest within Charles Halt's report were immediately dismissed out of hand by both the American and British authorities. They condemned the document as a masterclass of naivety and misunderstanding on the part of all the personnel who had been named within it. Indeed, the whole affair might well have gone on to be forgotten altogether, had it not been the second such incident to have taken place at RAF Bentwaters, involving unidentified flying objects. In August of 1956, radar operators at the base had detected a group of objects approaching from the sea at speeds of several thousand miles per hour. A C-47 transport aircraft, which had been coming into land at Bentwaters, had been forced to abort when a fast-moving white light had suddenly shot across its path, startling the pilot. Calls were made to the control tower at RAF Lakenheath, located 60 miles to the north, and they confirmed that they too were registering multiple unidentified aircraft on their radar screens. Not long after this, ground crews stationed at Lakenheath reported groups of luminous green and red objects moving around in the skies to the south of the base. Two de Havilland Venom fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the intruders, and soon confirmed visual contact with the objects. Almost immediately, one of the pilots was forced to disengage from the confrontation, as his flight instruments began to wildly malfunction. The remaining Venom pilot subsequently reported that he had been totally outpaced and outmaneuvered by one of the objects, which had then aggressively pursued him until he had broken off and headed back towards Lakenheath. When the UK government later tried to officially write these incidents off as a meteor shower, they found few commentators were willing to accept their version of events. The investigation into the Rendlesham sighting was allocated to General Charles Gabriel, who at the time was serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Air Forces in Europe. It took over 2 weeks for Gabriel to arrive at Bentwaters, and when he did so, it seemed to the airmen stationed there as if he had brought every possible alternative explanation for what they had witnessed along with him. According to Gabriel and his investigators, the objects that had been observed descending from the skies above the base on Boxing Day were the remains of a Soviet rocket which had been re-entering Earth's atmosphere, having propelled a satellite up into space. The red lights witnessed by Holt and his team in the early hours of the 28th of December would be similarly explained away. The Orford Ness Lighthouse was located a little further up the coastline from the two RAF bases. Investigators seized on two aspects of Holt's account, in which he described that the light he was witnessing was winking back at him. This statement, coupled with a similarity in the time taken for the lighthouse beam to complete a full rotation, and compared to the timings between the alleged sightings in Holt's audio recording, led them to assert that it was the lighthouse beacon he was witnessing off in the distance. But perhaps the most frustrating of the explanations offered by Gabriel and his team were the ones in relation to the alleged landing site in the clearing. The investigators reported that the indentations discovered on the ground were in fact animal burrows, as opposed to scorch marks. the damage which had been found on the sides of the trees there was dismissed as cuttings and markings from local Forestry Commission employees, or the work of pranksters and local youths. General Gabriel's investigation remains notorious for its lack of cooperation with the British authorities, as well as an accompanying campaign of threats and intimidation carried out towards the airmen involved. Steve Longereau and the sentries at Bentwaters maintain that they were ordered to sign official secrets documentation, barring them from discussing the incident for a 30-year period. At RAF Woodbridge, the investigating officers would end up going to even more drastic lengths. During interviews, some of the airmen were ordered not to discuss what they had seen with anybody else, and then advised that if they chose to contravene this order, bullets were cheap and would be used to enforce it. Some of the witnesses had far weirder experiences. One of the airmen was apparently summoned to attend an interview that was being conducted at a property close to the airbase. The individual found this odd, as it did not meet the usual security protocols, but attended anyway. He arrived at a remote farmhouse and was greeted by two gentlemen who were dressed incognito. As he sat and chatted to them for around half an hour, he couldn't help feeling that the whole situation was terribly wrong. There was something incredibly eerie about these two men, who he said had strange doll-like eyes and exhibited bizarre mannerisms. He had a distinct sense that they were not who they claimed to be, and made his excuses to leave. His superior had no knowledge of this summons when the airman mentioned it to him, and demanded to know where this meeting had taken place. They arrived at the farmhouse a few hours later, only to find it dilapidated and run down. It looked as though it hadn't been lived in for many years, despite the fact it had been fully decorated and furnished when the airmen had been there just a few hours before. This whole episode apparently affected the young recruit to such an extent that he had to seek therapy in the months afterwards. These overt and aggressive efforts to gloss over the incident by the American authorities seem to be in stark contrast to their official findings. If what the men at the two air bases encountered was simply a remarkable convergence of natural phenomena, then why would their superiors go to such great lengths to try and suppress any testimony of the sightings? Could it be that what occurred does indeed have a more rational explanation than extraterrestrial visitors, but one that would be as equally disturbing to the British public? It has long been speculated that the two air bases were in fact being used by the US Air Force to stockpile nuclear weaponry, despite assurances by Margaret Thatcher to Parliament that this was not the case. Rather than some form of surveillance by an unknown party, is it possible that it was indeed the Soviets who were monitoring the two bases and their defences? Witnesses who have spoken out claim that the beams of light descending on the facilities were concentrated in the vicinity of the weapons lockers. Was this some form of advanced or experimental Soviet technology, trying to probe the American defences and detect the nuclear weaponry that was allegedly being concealed there? Maybe, but time has moved on 40 years, and we have yet to see technology of this magnitude emerge from any nation, let alone Russia. In the decade since the incident, further explanations for what took place have emerged, which vary wildly in terms of credibility. One of these is that the hapless airmen were unwilling participants in experiments conducted by their own government. Some believe that what transpired may have been the result of hallucinogens, or some degree of mind control that the men were unaware of. Many believe that neither airbase was simply the forward operating post that the United States Air Force assert. It has been alleged that in recent years, a local resident who upgraded their internet was told by the engineer who carried out the work that he had found a mysterious bundle of buried cables leading off towards the base. He described these as being powerful internet cables that apparently dated back to the early 1980s, long before they had been invented. In addition to allegations that the locations were secret testing grounds for experimental weaponry, other stories have emerged that revolve around the personnel who were based there. Some believed that the sightings were the result of pranks being played between the sentries at the two bases, who had rigged up coloured lights on their patrol vehicles and then driven around at speed in an attempt to scare their opposite numbers. It has also been claimed that in August of 1980, a few months before the incident, an SAS team was tasked with testing the security arrangements at the two sites. The specialists parachuted into one of the bases, but were easily detected as the radar systems had recently been upgraded without their knowledge. The British servicemen were then captured and humiliated, before later being released. In revenge for this discomfiture, it is alleged that the SAS decided to cause a major embarrassment for their American visitors. During the winter of 1980, they rigged up a series of parachutes and kites, to which they added lights, flares and smoke canisters. These were then deployed in and around the two air bases, successfully resulting in a hugely public incident, much to the delight of the elite British soldiers. Such explanations do seem to resonate with the events which were described by Lieutenant Colonel Holt and his team. Already on edge as a result of the sightings from the previous evenings, it is entirely possible that on seeing unexpected lights throughout the area, these airmen could have misunderstood what they were seeing. But it is much more difficult to explain away the testimony of Jim Peniston and John Burroughs. Neither man had any obvious reason to lie about having encountered a floating craft in the woods, or to go to the lengths of fabricating written notes and sketches of what they had seen. Indeed, in the years that have passed since they retired from the Airforce, both men have gone on to be diagnosed and treated for PTSD. For his part, Peniston does not believe that the object he interacted with on that fateful evening came from outer space, but instead originated from much closer to home. He describes the sensation he felt when he touched the craft as an information download, and in later years provided ufologists with copies of the sequence of ones and zeros he had written down when they were fresh in his memory. The former staff sergeant claims that at the time of the incident, he did not know what binary code was, and only came to learn of the concept much later. Analysis of his notes appears to show a message, claiming that the craft originated in the year 8100, and that it had in fact travelled back through time, rather than space. Alongside this message, the code also contains coordinates for notable landmarks throughout human history, such as the pyramids and Stonehenge. Peniston's testimony is made all the more interesting by the striking similarities between the vessel he reportedly encountered and one which allegedly fell near the US town of Kecksburg in 1965. This was also described by those who witnessed it as being of a similar size and adorned with mysterious writing. Could this be the same, or even a similar craft, which had travelled back to modern times from the far future? It is perhaps unsurprising that the man who has done the most to raise awareness of the Rendlesham Forest incident is Lieutenant Colonel Holt himself. He has spent the time since his retirement from the United States Air Force continuing to investigate the encounters, writing a number of books, and participating in several films and interviews pertaining to the event. Many commentators have sought to rubbish the testimony of the servicemen who were involved in the incident. They point to the fact that these were 19 and 20-year-old airmen, stationed far from home in an unfamiliar environment. Given these circumstances, is it not surprising they may have misinterpreted events due to their overactive imaginations and anxieties? Whilst this is a compelling argument, Holt remains a far more difficult source to discredit. He was a veteran of both the Vietnam and Korean Wars, an experienced officer noted by his superiors for both his honour and his integrity. Since he left military service, he has never made any effort to alter or change the account he had initially made to the authorities, one that arguably stunted any further advancement in his career. The audio recording Holt made during the second encounter is easy enough to find on the internet, and lays bare the thoughts and fears he felt about the objects he was seeing. Nobody has ever been able to convince him that what he was witnessing was the result of the brake lights of passing vehicles reflecting off low cloud cover, or the rotating beacon of a lighthouse seen off in the far distance. With the US High Command having gone to such great lengths to discredit Lieutenant Colonel Hult's report, are we really to believe that several hundred American airmen who were stationed across two separate locations all misinterpreted and misunderstood what they were seeing? That such highly trained military personnel were bamboozled by rogue atmospheric formations and the revolving light of a neighbouring lighthouse? These were professional soldiers, who in some cases were battle-hardened from previous events in their careers. Given their backgrounds and experiences, their accounts should automatically hold a greater degree of weight and accuracy than those given by civilian witnesses, and should have been a cause for concern to the authorities, as opposed to being ridiculed. The explanations offered by American commanders do not account for the fact that the reported incidents were spread over a number of different nights, and across two different air bases. They also do not account for the radioactive readings detected by the airmen, or the reports of lights being cast down onto the metal containers that were allegedly housing nuclear weapons. There is little doubt that at least some of what was reported by those involved during the Rendlesham incident did indeed take place, and is very difficult to explain using conventional means. This can only leave us to conclude that something inexplicable did pay a visit to rural Suffolk on that cold December morning, exactly 40 years ago, to the day. Bedtime story.